Welcome back to part 2 of Essence of Wonder. We're now moving on to our main event of the evening. Chris, come on in and take it over. And Dave,
hello.
feel free to join us. Chris, thank you again for coming on the show. I do appreciate it.
Glad to. Love to see my face on a very tiny screen.
Fair enough. David has joined us.
Yes,
perfect.
I'm back on.
That note, so
Excellent.
in this interview, I will participate once in a while, but this is mainly your thing. So take it away. I'll be quiet.
Okay. Hey, David, thank you so much for being here. And let me start with a question I always ask writers: is what turned you into a fan of genre fiction?
Oh gosh, I think it's reading great genre fiction. Obviously, you know, when I was young, I was really into science. I studied pre-medical microbiology in college. Wanted to be a doctor. Thought I'd write on the side, but I had a brother-in-law who forced me to read Lord of the Rings when I was 16, and I didn't read it right away. I'd read lots of books. I read a lot of nonfiction books. But when I picked up Lord of the Rings and started reading it, I think I got to about page 93 where I said, oh, this is finally getting interesting. All that stuff about hobbits and their big feet and stuff didn't excite me. But anyway, I read Lord of the Rings, and then afterwards I went looking for a bookstore that had other books like that. I ended up at the Grassroots bookstore in Corvallis, Oregon, which was the first store that I'd ever seen that called itself a fantasy bookstore. They sold roach clips, bongs, and fantasy novels. And so anyway, I started frequenting the place, and I would pick up fantasy books. And pretty soon I read everything I could possibly find, probably within 6 months. And so I thought, well, why don't I just start making up stories? And I think that's where it began. I was about 17 at the time. And started writing my first novel, got halfway through it and realized I didn't know how to write. And so I started really studying the art of writing, I guess, with the idea of someday becoming a writer. And so that's how it got going.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and so once you've started as a genre fan, did you find that the transition to becoming a genre writer was as appealing as just launching yourself in other people's worlds was creating your own?
When I started in college, I went to Brigham Young University, and I had a couple of teachers who said, you can't write fantasy genre fiction because it's not real literature. And so I got steered toward writing literary fiction, and I turned in actually my first short story that I wrote in college, and won 3rd place in a little writing contest, and decided that for the next year, my goal was to try to win 1st place in a writing contest. I wrote half a dozen stories. I studied writing and figured out how you win a writing contest, or how it would be possible to win. And the next year, when I entered the writing contests, I won all of the writing contests that I entered. I took 1st place in all of them. That led to my first 3-novel contract with Bantam Books, because I won the L. Ron Hubbard International Writers of the Future Gold Award, and so just a couple of weeks after that, I got my very first novel contract, and I was off out to writing. So it wasn't necessarily a bump-free ride, in that I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I know that when I first started, I wrote kind of a cyberpunk piece with a Latin American protagonist. I wanted to do something that I hadn't seen before. I wanted to bring something new to the genre, and that's always been appealing to me. But figuring out yourself as a writer, I think, was probably one of the hard parts for me. I knew that I wanted to write fantasy. I'd always loved fantasy, but I also love science fiction, and I love mainstream, and I like historicals, and I love children's literature. And so I'm one of those people that doesn't just stick to one genre.
And you've written historical really well. Was it in the Company of Angels?
Yes, yeah. I won the Whitney Award for Best Book of the Year with In the Company of Angels, which was a historical novel set back in 1856 about pioneers crossing the plains. Then with my, I wrote a novel called Nightingale that was a young adult book, contemporary young adult, and I won the International Book Award for that for Best Young Adult Novel of the Year. And you know, a number of other things like that. So I keep winning in different genres in whatever I do, basically. I mean, whether it be, you know, I've won awards for poetry, short fiction, novels, and a bunch of different genres.
Mhm. And so when you're writing a historical, how does that preparation process differ? I mean, I imagine it's a lot more having to deal with the research, but also, is there something different to the actual writing portion of it?
You know, I think you have to recognize a good story, and there's not much difference between a good fiction story and a good historical story. But a lot of the process is really getting deep into the research and saying what would make a good story, or what should I emphasize that's actually true. And so I would look at, for example, I mapped out this journey that these people took across the plains, and then I drove across the country and actually drove along the route that they went and took notes on the kinds of plants. I had one big scene that where these starving people had to walk up through the mountains during a snowstorm. So I went into a snowstorm and made sure that I made the same journey at the same time. You know, so I wanted to try to capture what really would have happened. And that just takes an awful lot of effort. After doing a historical novel, I just realized, okay, you don't save any time by doing that. You spend all your time researching instead. And of course, I'm doing another historical now too. But yeah, it's a lot of fun, but it's still the same storytelling.
Okay, now I want to sort of go into, because you are one of the premier figures in teaching people how to become geniuses.
Mhm.
And so how do you recognize when someone has the potential to go forward into bigger and better things?
You know, years ago, I taught a writing class at BYU, and my very first class, I came home and my wife said, "Well, did you find any? You know, geniuses? You find any great writers?" And I said, "Yes, I found three." And she said, "Who?" And I said, "Well, there's Brandon Sanderson and Dan Wells and one other person, except this other person is going to be rich, and I don't think that he's going to go into writing." And she says, how do you know? How could you possibly tell? You haven't even read anything they've written. And the two things I look for are brilliance and passion. If I find someone who's passionate about writing and is also brilliant, I can teach them. If they lack those two capabilities, then I probably can't.
Yeah, and Brandon happens to be the favorite writer of everyone at my work. And I am fairly certain the reason why I got the job was he was my image. Him holding my Hugo was the image on my phone.
There you go.
It's always the little things. But so actually, let's sort of get into this whole how do you help a new writer thing. And let's start with what should a new writer do before they start getting their work out there? What should be their first sort of goals?
Sure. Before you even start writing, you know, if you've decided that you want to be a writer, you have to figure out how you're going to sell your work. You know, are you going to be a traditionally published author versus an indie author? Either way, the process is the same. You've got to start a website. You've got to start collecting names of people who want to buy your books so that you have, you know, 15, 20, 100,000 people who are interested in you. And that means that you've got to start doing a little bit of blogging in this world. Now, there are other ways to do it. There's a number of methods that you can use to build a big following, but typically that's the first thing that you're going to do is start developing a public persona, I guess is about the easy way to put it. You know, saying, okay, I'm gonna put myself out there. I'm going to commit and tell people I'm going to be a writer. And I expect my neighbors to hold me accountable. And I think that's one of the first things. Beyond that, there's reading. You have to love what you're doing. And if you don't love to read and you don't love writing, and there are some people who hate writing, who find it so difficult that it's just annoying. But I think that you have to enjoy the process. And writing is very much like reading. You put yourself into a trance-like state. You imagine exactly what's going to happen. You write it down, what happened in your imagination, and try to write it beautifully. And it's very much like receiving a story when you've had it read to you by somebody else. And so if you enjoy that process, I think that you're probably going to be primed to be a writer.
Excellent. And so, yeah.
Go ahead,
Go
Chris.
Gadi.
I have something to
No, it's you.
I can wait. No, I can wait. Please, go ahead.
Okay, I'll be
We're
polite
still
this
in a
time and let
meeting
me go
right
first.
now. I'm sorry. Let's try a couple of those tropes. I'm sorry. Are you muted? Oh, I was muted. Sorry. Please go on.
So after you've sweat, bled, bargained, bartered, and made that first book written, what should be your first goal? What should be your next step?
Well, there's a lot of things that you have to worry about. When you want to figure out where you're going to sell it, and so you may decide that, okay, if you want to go traditional, then you have to study who the publishers are, who the editors are, and who the agents are, and you study them in that order. You find out who the biggest and most successful publishers are, because those are the ones that can pay you, and that they're experts at selling. And then you find out who the editors are that work at that publisher. Sometimes you'll have an editor who has a really well-known name and they aren't buying any books. They haven't bought a book in 10 years, but there's some other junior editor down there who's buying books like mad and trying to build his list. And so you find out who the editors are, and then you find out who can sell it to those editors. Some editors have agents that they absolutely hate. They flee from them if they see them in public. And so you don't want that agent. You want the people that they enjoy working with. And so try to find out what their relationships are. And you can find that by going to www.publishersmarketplace.com, and you can buy a membership, and you can go back and see, okay, what has this editor bought? Who did he buy it from? When? And you can learn a little bit about the relationships. And that's one way that you can do it. Or you can go self-published, and boy, you've got to start learning about marketing your book. How do you make a cover? How do you design a book? How do you get people to find out about your book? Because even if you go online and you're selling books online, if you don't understand things like how to create ads on Goodreads and Facebook and stuff like that, nobody's ever going to see your work. So there's a lot of research that goes into understanding how to launch a book, regardless of whether you're going to be a self-published author or a traditionally published author.
It's
Why don't you go?
No, I'm going now. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I was muted. I'm kidding. I would love to hear more from you about writing and the business of writing, but I figure you talk about that a lot. I would like to ask about Rune Lords, actually, from a little bit. I'm sure you heard it all before, but for me, it's kind of an important question.
Yeah.
Well, it's not necessarily addressed as much, and let's look only at half of the first book, or even the first quarter. The leading theme for me was ethics and an inherited chain of ethics, and how everybody along that chain becoming victimizes somebody else in turn. Meaning, not to spoil it for too many people, but just stopping at the magic system. If you would like to take something from me, some attribute from me, you would use a rune and put it on my body. That said, I can be a hub where I put runes on my body and you take that from me in turn. And as it goes through that chain, it feels like it's a devolving ethics, and involves everybody in that endless cycle. And I was wondering if you thought about it in advance, if I'm even right, and kind of how you think about it today.
Well, when I wrote the Rune Lords, I'd actually had a friend who did some work for me, and I wanted to pay him for it, and he asked for $10 an hour, and I offered him 25, and he just thought that was way too much. And I said, well, look, you know, I'm taking you away from your family and all of this. And so, yeah, 25 isn't too much. So, you know, here you go. And it got me thinking about the ethics of business. The fact that when you work for someone, they're taking something from you. They're taking your talents, you know, your own gifts. Maybe it's the sweat of your brow, or the strength of your back, or your intellectual wisdom, or whatever. And they're purchasing that. And I got to thinking about, what is it as employers that we owe to other people and this kind of thing. And so, yeah, I definitely got very much into ethics. I had also been thinking ever since I wrote my first novel about what is good and evil. And on a very personal level, how can you define what good and evil are? And I believe that there's a biological component to it that has nothing to do with, oh, well, in this situation, you know, it's not relativistic, you know. And so I was playing upon those ideas as I was writing it, and really wanted to get deeper into philosophy. And I've had a lot of people particularly people from Oxford, who are writing their theses on the Rune Lords and the ethical systems, and my philosophies basically for college. And so I've found that there's a lot of people who are fascinated by it. But yeah, definitely, it wasn't something that just happened by accident. You know, I was an old hippie back in the 1960s and 70s, and I've always thought that there was a time as a teenager where we dreamed of creating this new world that was going to be so much better than the world that our parents left us. And, you know, I look at the world now and I see, man, what a mess we've created. You know,
we can always blame your generation, just saying.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the idea was we were going to get rid of greed and things like that, and help each other and stuff. And you know, so at heart, I guess I'm a revolutionary. I still want to change the world. And that's basically what I do with my writing.
And that brings us, of course, to the most important point of all. Rune Lords number 9. It's happening.
Rune Lords number 9. You know, I got to it, and I took a long break. You know, Tolkien took a long break when he was going to write Lord of the Rings. He got a third of the way through it, and he said, you know, I had Gandalf standing at the doors at the Mines of Moria and trying to figure out how to get through that door. And he stood there for many years, and it was 10 years before he started writing. And I thought, I got to a point where I didn't want to be rushed. And my editor was rushing me. You know, he said, get that damn novel in, you know, by next month, or we're going to do it. And I felt like there was something wrong. Like I wanted to work on it harder. And so, you know, you kind of look at it and say, yeah, I want this to be fantastic. And so I just kind of backed off from it. So I'm working on it now. I have about 800 pages written. And it's probably going to have another 300 pages in it. And then I'm going to have to go through and cut out a bunch of crud and revise it and stuff like that, get the bones to the story straightened, and then go through and do that. I think I'm probably about 3 months out. So I'm just having fun with it, you know. I'm not the kind of writer who can just go out and put out books every other day. For me, I want them to be perfect. And one of the things that I always try to do is I'm always looking to write something that's harder than the last thing that I wrote, I guess. I keep wanting to raise the bar, because I think the bars are pretty low. You know, there's a lot of things out there that you can get published that probably shouldn't be published. I don't want this to just be another space filler, you know, on the shelves at a bookstore, you know, where the publisher says, yeah, we got to have something come out this month. So, you know, I'm trying to make it special.
It seems to me like you're trying to make quite a few things special. So this will tie in with the next question. But so I'm very much a beginner writer. I started as sort of a hobby less than a year ago, and you helped me put me on the right track, and I truly appreciate that. I've attended many workshops, and yours has certainly changed a lot of things for me, far more than most others, if not all. And one thing I noticed, and now that you were talking as a professional, done it for 30 years or so, I thought about this. At first I tried to rush myself, get more stories out there, get more things done, publish them, the usual advice people give. And then I found out, you know what, I enjoy the process. I enjoy doing it slowly. I enjoy making it better and more. And I kind of adopted that process for a while. I also tried to change it after a while to try and make it better by submitting a story every week, for example. But one thing I did learn is that unlike many other forms of practice or hobbies or professions, I can cheat. Meaning, if you're a martial artist and you're trying to do better than usual, you can practice it for months and it will be perfect. You will not improve generally of course you will improve through practice, but it won't make you a better dancer by 10 years. That said, with writing, I find out that if I work on a story more and more and more and get it better, up to my, let's call it glass ceiling for a second, with apologies for taking that term, for example, not knowing about how to use point of view right, but up to that point, I can make it better if I wrote it 2-3 years down the line. And it's amazing for me to hear you say that. And you're bringing all this insight now through your Apex group, trying to push other people and make essentially the world better for writers in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit?
With the Apex group, years ago when I was in college, I think I was studying Ernest Hemingway and some other writers, and I noticed that Ernest Hemingway was exchanging letters with other people, all of whom ended up winning the Nobel Prize. Okay, they basically had a writing group going that they were handling by letters, and then I looked at the Inklings with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and I said, why can't we have a writing group like that? And then I thought, we can do it online, and we can create the best writing group there's ever been. And I keep thinking, why doesn't somebody do that? And it suddenly dawned on me that I should do that. And so what I've tried to do with the writing group is I started Apex 3 months ago, and that it's a small group, 250 people right now, but there's an awful lot that we can do for each other. And by that, I mean critiquing manuscripts, having times where people are working on writing at the same time and giving feedback. Hey, I just finished 2,000 words in an hour or something like that. We can basically help each other be better, and it doesn't matter where you live in the world. You can be in Israel and somebody else in the group is in Spain, and we've got people in Australia and the United States. And so I see that there's an awful lot that we can do, that we can teach each other, not just about how to write, but also how to make it easier ourselves, how to break in easier and how to break out easier, how to become huge bestsellers. And so that's kind of my goal for this year, as I decided, why not start what could be the world's best writing group and see if we could make it into the world's best writing group. And that's all I'm trying to do. Make it easier for writers. I don't think that a writer needs to be impoverished and starving in a garret somewhere. If you learn this craft properly, I can teach you how to be a publishable author in probably about 2 to 3 weeks for most people, and I could take you from that to being an award-winning author in a couple of months, and so becoming a bestseller just kind of follows as you do it. So ideally, if somebody really wants to learn this and is dedicated to the craft, it's not a hard thing to do. I know it's magic, but it's not. Yeah, it's like you said, it's a science. It's partly science. It's just a lot of it's a science that people don't understand. And so when we get into, for example, in studying hypnosis, and you look at the different mental states that people are in, the alpha state versus the beta state versus the theta state, I can show you how to move a person from the beta state into the theta state really easily, in an hour. And if you practice it, you ought to be able to do it with pretty minimal effort within that hour. And if you do it enough, we can get somebody into a deep enough trance that they love your work. And when they're done, it's like, wow, I lived through this experience. And that's what I'm trying to teach people.
It's interesting. We got a question from John asking, what do you feel the next big thing in genre fiction will be?
Oh, gosh. The next big thing in genre fiction, it's kind of interesting. There are certain stories that that publishers don't buy, and the reason they don't buy them is that they're just kind of outside the field enough that they don't know what to do with them. And I give you an example. A good example of that is almost always it's a long book, a book that's longer than any other. With Harry Potter, for example, I was writing for Scholastic years ago, and I turned in my first little book for Scholastic. It was some Star Wars books, and for middle grade readers. And my editor said, you know, the managing editor here absolutely loved that Star Wars book. She said it was the funnest thing we've published in 32 years. And I said, well, that's high praise indeed. That's very nice. I didn't know who the managing editor was or what a managing editor was. But he said, you know, we know that you run this big writing contest. Would you be willing to look at some books and help us choose one to push big? And so I looked at some of their books and I said, push Harry Potter big. And so she called me up, the managing editor called me, and she says, well, you know, the marketing department hates that. Say it's too long. Kids will never read it. And I told her exactly why they would read it and why it would work really well. And she sat down and she said, I think you're right. She said, how do we sell that book big? And so I created a marketing plan on how to sell the book big. But Harry Potter was too fat for kids to read. Almost all the time when a book is too big for its genre, too many pages, people love the book. So you can look at Dune, rejected over 40 times, okay, before it became the best-selling science fiction novel of all time. Or you can look at A Tale of Two Cities, which never found a publisher. The author had to go self-publish the book before it became the best-selling book of the next 100 years. And so what it really comes down to is understanding what it is that readers want. If you understand that the number one thing that people are looking for is transport into another world, one that occupies not just their senses, but also their mind and their emotions. If you understand that you can do that, then you understand the key to figuring out what the next big book will be. It will be the book that transports us the best into another world that we haven't seen before. And it doesn't matter the genre. There's a lot of audiences that aren't being served properly. And so it's a matter of actually looking at something and saying, okay, we could do it with this kind of novel. So I can kind of show you how to do it when I see it. And if we sat down and I talk to an author and find out what their interests are, then I can come up with a game plan. Like, okay, let's go do this. So for example, with Stephanie Meyer, she was one of my students at BYU, and she came and asked, how do I become the best-selling young adult novel of all time, young adult author of all time? And my first thought was, are you sure you really want that? That's a scary thing to want, because you're going to be hounded, and it's also going to bring resentment from a lot of other writers who are going to hate you for being the number one. But in any case, we sat down and outlined started brainstorming what became Twilight, and talked about how she could go about that path. But it was her path, you know. My wife asked me when I got done, she says, you know, why don't you go write that novel? And I said, because I'm not Stephanie Meyer. You know, if I wrote a novel about a 16-year-old girl who was in love with somebody that had unusual powers, people would think I was creepy. I couldn't get away with it. So that was a novel that she had to write. Well, my goal with authors is to try to figure out what's the novel that you have to write. And we go from there.
Oh, excellent. Cool. Now, I know you worked on movies as well. Mm-hmm. And when I was looking through, I noticed you worked on a fantasy film series in China, and I desperately want to hear about that.
Well, you know, a lot of China's a tough country to break into because the Communist Party controls everything. And I'll put it this way. I was talking to a producer and I was asking him, I said, you know, did the Chinese government bring us over, or was it the Chinese mob, or was it Chinese businessmen? And he says, oh, that's the great thing about China, all the same people. Okay, so when it came right down to it, I was working with somebody who wanted to make a big movie, but then they decided, well, they got into it and they just couldn't get the clearances, the permission from the communist government to go ahead and start making those movies. So those are kind of stillborn efforts. Maybe they'll come back and actually make them someday, but I just don't know. It was just after the recession started and we got into it. I think we had a good series of movies that we came up for them. It's just that they have to be filmed yet.
That is always the case.
Yes,
And what's
exactly.
your other, have you written screenplays?
You know, I just did a screenplay for the Rune Lords for a TV series. And so I'm hoping that will go through. It's being shopped at a couple of different studios right now. I've heard that last week I heard that both, I think it was Fox and let's see, what was it? Oh gosh, can't remember. One of the other studios, guys that make comic books, Dark Horse.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know that they were getting into film anyway, but they were both looking at it. So we'll see.
Oh, excellent. That seems like it'd be a really fun series for Phil.
Yeah. I think it'll be good. You know, we're looking at doing the first book for the first season, second book for the second season, that kind of thing. So I think it could be fun.
And that just means you have to write the next book because you can't finish a series before you've written the book that it's based on.
I think so. Yeah, you can't. It's been done, been tried. A little hard.
Yes, excellent. Okay, so I have a question I ask everyone, from Nobel Prize winners to average everyday people I run into, and it is this: you have a sandwich, and you cut this sandwich in half. Do you now have one sandwich or two sandwiches?
Well, I've got two sandwiches now because I can split them and share them so much easier.
That is an excellent answer, but...
Can I take a stab at it before you continue?
Oh, absolutely.
You have both. It's a Schrodinger's cat situation.
There you go.
That's a good answer.
I can eat one now and the other one later.
Oh, so I love because this is a question you can dig your teeth into, pun somewhat intended and greatly regretted, because you have the concepts of, well, you could look at it as Marxist if you can sell it as two sandwiches and it's two sandwiches, but every Nobel Prize winner I've asked has said one sandwich. But Neil deGrasse Tyson said two, so you're in good company.
Wait. I wanna re-examine my answer. What kind of sandwich? I need to know what kind of sandwich. And you know, it's a PB&J.
All sandwiches are peanut butter and jelly with substitutions for the peanut butter and the jelly.
Well, would you accept ketchup on the sandwich?
Now you're getting into philosophy.
Okay, if you take a pizza and you do this, kind of putting it together, cutting it into half, is that a sandwich?
Yes,
I know.
Of course.
I would like to ask you a question right there, Chris, and you, Dave. Is a hamburger a sandwich?
Yes. Hamburger's definitely a sandwich.
You just got half the world to hate you right there.
I subscribe to the cube theory. If you have one and meat on top of it, or any other thing, you have a tostada. If you have two, you have a sandwich. Hamburgers fall in that. Or if you have three, so 1, 2, 3, you have a taco. And there are, of course, variations on the taco around the world. But up to 6, which is the calzone, also called the empanada, also called dinner, which I am now really hungry. Thanks a lot. I'm starving now. Yes. David, I have two more interesting questions. One from my kids.
Does that mean that your questions before are not interesting?
All questions are interesting until I ask them. But actually, here's a question that's really interesting, I think, to sort of find this. Do you find that you read as a writer now?
Absolutely. I mean, ideally, when you're reading, you should be able to turn off your critical brain and that type of thing. And so when I'm reading, for example, with Writers of the Future, it's a huge writing contest, and I've got thousands of entries. And when I've got a story and I start reading it, typically I'm making all sorts of judgments in the opening. And if I can get through the first 3 to 4 pages and suddenly find myself immersed in the story, so that I'm no longer making judgments and I'm just enjoying it, then I'm into the reader phase. And that's when I know I've got a good story. Because, you know, if I've got a malformed story, I notice it pretty quick.
Nice. And now another question that I think is really interesting that I'm asking a lot of people is, so we're all shut down in our own little worlds. What are you reading for you?
What am I reading for me? Well, that's an interesting question. I've always got a little bit of nonfiction or something like that I'm reading, and I tend to read thrillers a lot, just for the fun of it. But you know, I'm just sort of a sucker for just about anything. I'll read the back of a cereal box, you know. Let's see.
That's how Faulkner got started.
I just tried to figure out what right now, I'm teaching a workshop online. And so, so for this week, my goal has been to get through Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. So that's not really just for me. That's more of a egghead, this is for my students kind of thing. So, you know, it's not just for enjoyment. It's more for studying how to tell stories better.
Nice. Gadi, you got anything?
I've just been thinking, you know, about trying to change the topic for a bit. I know that you once told a story, and I'll ask you to tell it again without me repeating it before you tell it, about how you shifted the emotional aspect of what you were looking for from the judges of Writers of the Future, where you asked them to start looking at something else.
Okay, repeat the question. I'm trying to think.
Essentially, in Writers of the Future, you used to ask them more technical questions, and one day you started asking them to look more at how it made them feel, right?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that with Writers of the Future is I found that I can look at a story, and if I look at a story and I look at the technical expertise of the author, let's say that I find an author and they're really great at characterization, or they're just dynamite when it comes to handling dialogue, or their pacing is just spot on, just perfect. All of those don't make any difference, okay? The story that's going to win the contest is the one that makes the reader cry the most, okay? Feel the most profoundly. And so I'm looking for the story that you can set it down, and when you come back the next day, it immediately jumps to the front of your mind and says, yeah, this is the one that wins, okay? And very often that's not the one that has the highest technical expertise. It's the one that's the most moving. And so that's what I look for in a story. Years ago, there's a fellow who won a big writing contest that was put on by a national magazine, by Writer's Digest or something like that. I can't remember. But anyway, they had like 10,000 entries and he won it. And then the next year he won it again. And everybody said, well, wait a minute, with 10,000 entries, you know, times 10,000 entries, there's one in 100 million chance that you should have been able to win this. And he pointed out, he said, you know, the story that makes you cry the most wins. And so we're looking for the thing that has the strongest emotional impact. Now, I also like a strong intellectual impact, but they're usually tied together. So I'm looking for the story that really hits you in the heart.
Actually, got another wonderful question here from Tamara or Tamara. Is there room for another series in the marketplace today that has the success of Harry Potter? And what would it take to achieve that?
Yes, there is room for another series. I don't think that it would be a middle grade series necessarily. I think that if you tried to be like Harry Potter too much, that the editors would all say, "Oh, that's been done." so you have to figure out whether you want to go for an adult audience or a young adult audience. But there's certainly ways to do it. Now with Harry Potter, what the author was doing was she was writing a story that aroused a strong sense of wonder, but also had humor and horror and a good sense of adventure to it. And so you'd have to change the emotional beats if you go to a different age group. And so you have to understand how to do that. But there's also, each story has its own shape. And so if you were to have a protagonist who was a male protagonist, the hero's journey story tends to be loved by males. But if you're an older person who likes mysteries, then the onion skin plot comes into play. If you are a female protagonist, then the round story that Ursula K. Le Guin used to champion would be a better choice for that. So understanding how to layer in different shapes of stories for each protagonist so that you have different groups rooting for each of your several protagonists in that story. That would be the key to understanding how to beat J.K. Rowling.
Mm-hmm.
And it is possible. You can beat J.K. Rowling. I can show you how to do it.
I'm sure you could show me how to do it. I'm fairly certain I couldn't do it.
Yes, I know. That's the problem. It's like teaching somebody who doesn't have legs how to swim. You can say, yes, this is how you would do it in theory,
Captain Picard said, forgive me for going there, or I will not forgive myself. I love Captain Picard. He said, you can do everything right and still fail, when he was talking to Data.
That's right. Yep.
And you can do everything wrong and also succeed.
Well,
my life.
that gets back to the editors, because if you did do everything right, if you did write that great big, fat book that's got 10 books in the series and you submitted that to a publisher, you would have a devil of a time finding a publisher. You'd have people who look at it and say, oh gosh, I'm skeptical. I don't know if we should invest that much money into trying to promote a book from somebody who's unknown, et cetera, et cetera. And so you tend to get passed over. So yeah, you can do everything right and you're still kind of at the mercy of the publishers.
One of the reasons, there are many reasons. Number one, the domain was open. Number two, I really like Wonder. Number three, I really like Essence, meaning what's actually in there. But one of the places where I got the idea for the name of the show, even if I didn't think about it at the time, was from you, in Essence of Wonder. Mm-hmm. And I have to admit, attending your workshop, there are a few things that truly shaped me as the beginning writer that I am. Looking back, not that long ago. One of them was the idea of wonder hooks. Everybody talked about action hook and different types of hooks, but learning about wonder, that feeling, and opening up the idea of resonance, opening up a book, an epic fantasy book, you'll nearly always find in the first page or in the first paragraph a reference to castles or dragons and kings, a vastness of time, sometimes actually saying 10,000 years or over a vastness of time. And looking at where that resonates within changed my outlook at life in general. When I look at the emotional resonance of things, or if I read some chapter somebody asked me to write the other day, and all of a sudden there was magic. Somebody just did something that was magical but wasn't explained. Oh, wonder. I started writing in my critique, specifically to what they asked was, how do you feel in each moment? Interesting, bored. I also write wonder now. So that is something that shaped me. Another thing I would like to ask you to talk about, as opposed to me telling you what you're saying, is more tactical, not so philosophical, not so high level, but one thing that I find you teach much better than everybody else. And that is how to make the book or the writing have more depth, and that's specifically around the KAV cycles. That has changed everything for me.
Yeah, the KAV cycle is something that I learned not from writers, but I learned when I started working with neurolinguistic programming, and basically the idea was that sociologists went back and looked at the speeches of Martin Luther King, and said, you know, why was he such a great speaker? You know, why did people have to stop and listen to him? And he noticed a pattern that when Martin Luther King would talk, he would say, he would first describe what a person was thinking, and then what they heard, and then what they saw. So he was appealing to all three senses: emotion, and then to sound, and then to visual sensory. And you need to appeal to those in order for people to really get into a story. You know, most of us learn in one of three different ways. Either you have to tell me what to do, or you have to show me what to do, or you have to let me do it myself. And so each of us is kind of hardwired to respond to different appeals. Well, you know, you've heard the saying a lot that you should show, don't tell. And what that really comes down to is that you have to use strong appeals to the senses in order to create the story in a person's mind. And so I started looking at it from the point of view of, okay, we have to have the KAV, but we aren't just like movie cameras where we just have KAV. We also have a sense of smell. We have tactile senses. We have a past history. We have internal dialogue that's going on, our thought patterns. And so the key to really getting deep into a viewpoint and immersing a reader into a story is to appeal to the senses in the proper order, so that it feels effortless for the reader to slide into that protagonist point of view and really bring the story to life. And so that's become, for the last few years, that's become my goal, is to just figure out how to do that better than anyone's done it before, you know. And there's a lot that goes into it, because as you pointed out, you know, when you start talking about arousing a sense of wonder and bringing magic into a story, we start using words like castles and knights and swords and things like that. And it immediately captures the interest of people, because you know, it brings them back to the fantasies they had when they were young. So very often language is what it is that we're trying to use to help us create the story and bring us into the story, but sometimes we're separated by language. Sometimes I use words a little bit differently from the way that you use them, or they have slightly different appeals to my senses and things like that. So, you know, you're juggling things. It's ultimately, I like to say, it's a science, you know, not an art. But then I have to realize, no, it really is an art. It's not a science. You know, we're doing the best that we can to tell a story and to communicate it from one person to another. As a writer, I feel like my job is to send out strong signals. I like to think of it like a radio tower, that I'm sending out the broadcasting signals to my reader. Now, my reader might be a busted old radio, you know, and he's getting an awful lot of static just because he's really bad at picking up signals. And so you're going to fail no matter what you do. You know, the very best job that you do at this, there are still going to be people who hate your work and hate you as a person and can't get into it. And you just have to realize that, okay, you do the best that you can do, and then you're done.
I got one last question for you, and it's a question. So imagine I'm a writer, and I come to you and I say, you know, David, greatest writer who ever lived. I look at the page when I'm about to start, and it terrifies me. Mm-hmm. What do you say to get them over that?
You know, what I do is I tell them to sit back, relax, close their eyes, and imagine that you're in the body of your protagonist, okay? And I just say, what are you doing? Where are you? Okay, well, I'm standing in a field in front of a castle and trying to work up the nerve to go up to the castle gate. And then I just say, okay, now describe. What do you do? What do you hear? What do you see? And eventually what's going to happen is as the character is walking up to the gate, a guard's going to accost them or something like that. They're going to try to divert them. And the question is, do they let themselves be diverted? And that's where the story starts. And so it's a matter of saying, don't look at the page, look inside yourself and get into that state. If you can learn to do that and then write down what happens really quickly, you'll find that you write publishable prose almost automatically. And that if you do it really well, if you learn how to do a few other things that I can teach you at the same time, you can write stories that'll win contests and win you awards. And so it's not really very hard. It's just learning how to report on what's happening in your imagination.
Cool. Got anything, Gadi?
There is so much I can ask, but I think it's time for us to wrap up. I really appreciate, and we all appreciate you coming on the show, and you too, Chris. I want to thank Dave, Steve, Karen, everybody, the team, for everything you've done today. And more than that, I would like to tell you a little bit of news. We have now joined YouTube. We've just started last week, but we now have all the videos up on YouTube from the David Weber show. We are now also transmitting and sharing recordings of the podcast after the show. And our website, as always, is essenceofwonder.com. I'm Gadi Evron, and this was Essence of Wonder. See you next week in Leadership in Crisis.